to this EER webinar. We're going to look at the future of Al-Qaeda after its leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was killed at the end of July. Obviously, there's been a lot going on in Afghanistan. A year ago, the US left. In the year since, the country has been ruled by jihadists, and there are other challenging jihadists, including the Islamic State, operating in the country. For Al-Qaeda itself, it's a question of whether a successor who has not yet been appointed will be of equal stature and able to keep the organization cohesive. So we're going to look to cover all of these matters, and we have an expert panel with us to do that. First is Afzal Amin, who's a commentator on strategy and international conflict and the CEO of London Expertise Limited. We have Tricia Bacon, who's an associate professor at the American University School of Public Affairs. And hopefully joining us, we have Ayman al-Zawahiri, who's a national security analyst and the co-president of the Counter-Narcoterrorism Alliance in Germany. We'll go to each of our speakers for a 10 or 15-minute presentation, and then we'll go to our audience for questions. If you do have questions, you can put them in the chat, and we will get round to them at the end of this. So Afzal, if we go to you for the first round.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to the European Radicalization for this very kind invitation. Of course, it was an incredible surprise that Ayman al-Zawahiri appeared in Kabul in what looked like broad daylight on his balcony before he was attacked and killed by an American military operation. I think it's worthwhile reminding ourselves how we got into this situation where we are targeting men of that age in that country using those means. Al-Qaeda itself, we must never forget, it comes from our own Western supported, funded, enabled response to the entry of the Soviet Union military forces into Afghanistan in the late 70s. And the Western world gathered resources to send volunteers to go and fight in Afghanistan against what was then labeled as a good jihad against the Soviet Union, and memorialized in films such as Rambo 3, which when I was a teenager was a great film to watch. And that relationship between the West and the origins of Al-Qaeda is worth remembering, because it has a direct bearing on how we plan for the next 20 or 30 years, because what then resulted in a victory for the West in the Soviet Union leaving Afghanistan actually ended up with tens of thousands of people who were now mobilized, radicalized, trained, and became a self-regulating jihadi movement outside of any nationalist or independence movement linked to a particular territory or a particular state. And that's probably been the single biggest aspect to note here, that there are this independent nature of Al-Qaeda, that it's not fighting for a particular country against a particular foreign occupation or a particular local government that they disagree with. It is a global jihadist mentality and ideology. And we have found, certainly in my work in the British Armed Forces working in Iraq and Afghanistan on counter-insurgency strategy, it was my observation during my military service, and it remains the case, that we consistently focus on the symptoms of this kind of radical ideology, and almost never on the root causes that brings about people willing to kill themselves and innocent thousands of others to achieve what's clearly an impossible and highly elusive aim, which is total victory. And our misdiagnosis of the problem actually brings about a binary effect on our enemies, in that they see us as people they have to fight until the end, and if that means death, then so be it. And they see the West as a monolithic bloc that has to be defeated completely in order for them to have that victory. And so we end up fighting the wrong war again and again. After what happened on 9/11, we should have seen an international policing effort led by counterterrorism experts in policing to bring those who were guilty of that attack to justice in the normal ways that we handle any other crime. Instead, we focused on invading two countries and then occupying them, and then trying to build nations in our own image. And one of the things that in the development of the West, we often forget is that the Treaty of Westphalia, which essentially is the basis of the modern state, where within a set territory, there's a monopoly on the use of violence by the state power, worked very well for the Europeans emerging from many hundreds of years of internecine warfare, just to limit who would be fighting whom where. This model has not worked so well on countries where communities are split in half by imposed borders. We see that in many countries, but particularly in Afghanistan, where there's a border with Pakistan. There are Pashtun people living on both sides of that border. When one side is affected, it affects family members on the other side. And this ends up where you have a cross-border relationship between the people that are fighting and the people who are supporting the fighting. And so any kind of occupation leading to nation building, if it doesn't take into account those sorts of factors, we then end up with a situation which we had, where a nation state like Pakistan was accused, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, as evidence on both sides of the argument, in supporting terrorism against the West, because the Taliban then took on this role of fighting the occupier. In that relationship between the Taliban and the Western forces, of which, of course, I was a serving officer and completed 3 tours in Kandahar, in Lashkar Gah, in Helmand, and also in Kabul. We found Al-Qaeda appearing here and there. It's only in the post sort of Taliban victory that we now see Al-Qaeda emerging as a commentator more than as a player. It's really in Iraq and central Middle Eastern regions on the Syrian-Iraqi border that Al-Qaeda remains a viable threat. But again, when the state of Iraq dealt with Al-Qaeda, it fought them very hard and crushed the thousands of people that had been mobilized. The ramifications are still being felt, because there are still several thousand young people, children, who were in Al-Qaeda camps, who are now still languishing in those camps. We in the West consistently misdiagnose these problems, and we focus very much on what people are saying rather than what we could be doing. And I would propose, I think, 2 very specific aspects that we need to look at for the future to prevent people like al-Zawahiri and others gaining the kind of power that they had in such a quick time. The first one is we should focus on long-term thinking. Actions, and we should do that by having actions which conform to our own values and our own laws. This cannot be said loudly enough, because once we compromise our own values, we lose the moral high ground, and losing that moral high ground actually empowers the people who are fighting against us. The second thing we should do is actively promote good governance. Because wherever there's poor governance, independent armed actors can rise. The Al-Shabaab group in Somalia is a very good example of that. Poor governance, poor state effectiveness results in ungoverned spaces in which militants can thrive. So good governance through open democratic systems, where there's the consent of the people to be ruled by the government who rules them. And this should be promoted actively by the West in all countries, regardless of short-term goals. And again, we return to this aspect of long-term thinking. A lot can be said about all of this, of course, and I'm very keen to hear questions from the audience and to the other panelists. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. If we can now go over to Tricia for the next round.
Yes, hello, good evening, everyone, from where I am in the world. I was having a little bit of internet connectivity problems, so do let me know if my video does not come through, and I can turn that off and just speak, but I think for the moment I'm okay. So when I saw the question that was motivating this event, Al-Qaeda after Zawahiri, my takeaway is that Al-Qaeda is really at an inflection point. It has a lot riding on this next phase of the organization, especially whoever becomes the next leader of the group whenever that is announced. I would say that it has some important advantages, and probably its biggest advantage is its affiliate network. Under Zawahiri, it did lose 2 affiliates. It created a new one. But there is also something that is probably not remarked on often enough, which is that during the period of the peak of the Islamic State challenge to Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda's affiliates stayed loyal. And the Islamic State was a preferable partner for all intents and purposes, right? It was the wealthiest organization in the world, and it captured the imaginations of tens of thousands of foreign fighters. It was controlling significant territory. And yet the Al-Qaeda affiliates, the groups that had sworn loyalty to Al-Qaeda and received a reciprocal endorsement from Al-Qaeda, all stayed loyal. So it has not only strong affiliates in that they're independent organizations that are able to manage their strategies and their day-to-day operations, but it has strong relationships with those affiliates. The way that I would put it in contrast to the Islamic State is Al-Qaeda has gone for quality over quantity. So it has those that it can fall back on. It, of course, has whatever the reality is, it's able to claim some involvement in the victory in Afghanistan. Of course, close analysis would suggest it was not a pivotal actor in the Taliban's victory, but it is like in the 1980s against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, it's able to claim a role in that victory. And of course, it has what we talk about the most, which is the modicum of safe haven in Afghanistan. Zawahiri's death demonstrates that this is not a place that is completely a sanctuary for the organization. There is some ability to undertake counterterrorism actions. On the other hand, if you look at most of the other theaters in the world, this is probably still arguably the safest, or at least one of the safest places for terrorist organizations to operate. It has some important disadvantages, especially in its competition with the Islamic State to be the leader of the Sunni jihadist movement. It has not been able to conduct a major attack in the West, which is its sort of signature in demonstrating its agenda, for well over a decade. It also is, while it's located in Afghanistan and thus has the safe haven, it's not operating in the heart of the Middle East, which is something that the Islamic State has been able to exploit at its apex. Of course, the Islamic State has a sheer number of affiliates, some of which are pretty viable organizations, others maybe aren't organizations at all. And the Islamic State also has a much more recent memory of its declaration of a caliphate, whereas 9/11 was now over 20 years ago, and Al-Qaeda doesn't have those kinds of same recent successes that it can point to the same degree. So looking forward at Al-Qaeda after Zawahiri, I think what comes into focus is what the role of leadership will be in this next phase. This is only Al-Qaeda's second leadership transition. And with my colleague at Georgetown, Elizabeth Arsenault, we've been doing a fair amount of work on leadership and really looking at what the role of, for example, a founding leader is. And bin Laden was a quintessential founding leader. He played this very important role in creating a foundation for the organization, in creating its ideology and its tactics and how it would recruit, and what we sort of refer to as the how and why of an organization. All founders do this, and bin Laden did this for longer than most founders and more thoroughly than most founders. And this creates a foundation from which the successors will operate from. And successors can make different levels of changes and different kinds of changes. And so Dr. Arsenault and I have sort of conceptualized different kinds of successors. And the idea is that they can either make no changes to what the founder has done, or just maybe incremental changes to what the founder has created, or they can make larger discontinuous changes. And they can do this to either the ideology, the why of an organization, or the how its tactics and how it mobilizes resources. And this produces 5 different types of successors: caretakers, signalers, fixers, visionaries, and figureheads. And caretakers are those that basically don't make anything except incremental changes to the how and the why. And that really was what Zawahiri did as a leader. He did not make any huge departures from the foundation that bin Laden created. And there's pros and cons to this kind of leadership. We don't really assess whether it's a good type or a bad type, or effective or ineffective. We more focus on this type of leadership. And what a caretaker can offer is continuity, right? These organizations, they can go through pretty tumultuous periods. Al-Qaeda was under a lot of external pressure. It was fighting for its survival. And Zawahiri primarily operated as this kind of caretaker leader. And it was particularly interesting that Zawahiri did this because if you look at his history of leadership, when he was a leader, for example, of al-Jihad in Egypt, he was a much different kind of leader then. So he adopted a different leader approach as bin Laden's successor. And there are times where he may have also been a figurehead, which is basically a kind of leader that is an absentee leader, either because of health, counterterrorism pressure, other circumstances. These are leaders who are not actively guiding the direction of their organization. And so while there's been a lot of debate about whether Zawahiri was effective or not, it's often not clear what the criteria for effectiveness would be. So what we argue is that he was a caretaker and he did fulfill the role of a caretaker. Now, whether Al-Qaeda needed a caretaker or a more dynamic leader is something I think we could debate. But what becomes clear is that this juncture, Al-Qaeda, in order to resurge and to rejuvenate, does need a more dynamic kind of leader, what we refer to as signalers, fixers, or visionaries. Those leaders that change either parts of the ideology in significant ways, parts of the tactics in significant ways, or both. And Al-Qaeda, in order to really recover and resurge, needs that kind of more dynamic leadership. It's not necessarily that survival was a small task under Zawahiri's leadership. There were plenty of challenges to the organization, especially by the time he inherited it. But in order to really, for Al-Qaeda to get a second wind, if you will, it will probably require this kind of more dynamic leadership. And of course, we're all waiting to find out who that will be, who will be his successor. Saif al-Adil is considered the front runner, but it is taking time. It's been, over a month since Zawahiri's death, so we're still waiting to hear who that will be. And one thing I would caution in this case is we do tend to focus as analysts as to the known quantities. And over the years that I've been working on these organizations, I have regularly been surprised by who a successor was. Now, that wasn't the case with Zawahiri. He was very clearly delineated as the successor to bin Laden. But in a number of organizations, we see leaders really come what appears to us as out of nowhere to take the leadership position. But just because we don't know of an individual doesn't mean that that individual doesn't have internal credibility, that doesn't have the ability to be a dynamic leader who can help. There are not a lot of analysts who knew about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi before he took the helm of the Islamic State. So I do want to caution as well that there can be surprises in both who is appointed the leader and what kind of leader they become. And sometimes even knowing that individual doesn't tell you as much about what kind of leader they'll be as you might suspect. As I mentioned, Zawahiri was a very different kind of leader over the course of his career as a jihadist. And overall, I also think it's worth a note of caution that there have been plenty of organizations who have been declared defeated or sort of irrevocably weakened, including the Afghan Taliban, including what was the Islamic State in Iraq, including groups like Al-Shabaab. And they have shown an ability to resurge, that to return to strength. And I don't think Al-Qaeda is immune from that possibility. As I said at the beginning, I think it's at an inflection point. It has sustained significant losses over the past 20 years, and it's actually remarkable that it survived the last 20 plus years of counterterrorism pressure and the challenge from the Islamic State. It still has some leaders who were, or individuals who were founding members of the organization. It has proven to be resilient in its ability to survive. And it does have a network of capable and strong alliances that can help the organization to resurge. So what I would say is it's not a foregone conclusion that Al-Qaeda will reemerge as a significant threat once again, but it's also not an impossibility. I think a lot will hinge on what will happen at this inflection point and under the next leader of Al-Qaeda. I welcome any questions or discussion that we can have at this point.
Thank you so much. If we can go over to Ajmal for the next 10-15 minutes.
Hello, good afternoon from Stuttgart, Germany. However, I just joined a little bit late. I couldn't catch the question, but never mind. I have the whole idea that it deals with the al-Zawahiri and also the Al-Qaeda. Some of my colleagues, they discussed about, they said that what happened in Kabul last month, that was a bit surprising for some of our colleagues, or for some of the countries, or for some of the agencies that they are countering terrorism and countering insurgency. For me, it was not a big surprise, because having had access to classified information, that we knew that al-Zawahiri is in Afghanistan. Even I myself in my organization, they had information, and we share some of the information that al-Zawahiri is back to Afghanistan and operating inside Afghanistan. But what I know that from my point of view is that so there is a close ties and connections between the ISI and also the Taliban. When you know that, and this guy was under the how can I say, there was a safe haven provided by Haqqani network, and Haqqani network is in a close contact with the Pakistani ISI. It means the Pakistani ISI have had this information, or has had this information long before that the US will start its operation. So the question is that who was involved, who gave this information, or I mean this intelligence shared? Of course, that was the ISI gave this information, and they were waiting for the right moment due to the economic hardship and also the economic problems that the country has. And then they were looking for the right moment, and they gave this information to the US, and US itself was looking for the right opportunity to, because of the midterm elections, whatever. And then they managed to strike and kill the most wanted guy on the earth, and they destroyed it. But the thing is, from my point of view, from that we have the two approaches to countering terrorism. There's the counter-terrorism and counter-violent extremism. I myself, as educated in Maryland University, as my point of view is that if we cannot counter or destroy the terrorism by the counter-terrorism measures, which is, for example, policing, intelligence, or arresting them, capturing them, killing them, or decapitation. So these are, they were not helpful in the past. So we did it, we tried, and the US did it. Not only we were not able to win the war on terror, but we made it more possible for other people to join this front. And most of the terrorists today we have, they were not the terrorists in the past. So my point of view is we have to look for the issues that how the terrorists could attract the people to join their groups. There are some, of course, there are some grievance like lawlessness or less education, and there are joblessness or economic problem or awareness. These are the things that the terrorists can use them, and then they could attract those people who are there, and then they get them. And the other option is for as far as I know, that the importance. You know that why the terrorists are doing it, because the importance matters for them. Some people are doing it to get the importance. Some of the people are doing it to maintain the importance, and some of the people, they're doing it to expand their importance. So what was done by for example, al-Zawahiri, or also about Osama bin Laden, they had a significant importance in the eyes of the US and also the Saudi government. And when the US mission was over, they lost their importance, and they enjoyed this importance in the past, and they tried to get it back and also to expand it, and therefore they established Al-Qaeda to only, from my point of view, is only to get back these importance that they had it in the past. So dealing in that way, I think the best possible way is that we have to stick to the principles of the counter violent extremism, which is, of course, intervention. It is prevention, and also rehabilitations and reintegration. And these are the methods that we could not only counter the terror, but also have a safer house. I mean, safer world, because as far as I know, that the U.S. now trying to convince, for example, to double the war on terror, and also they said they have to lay out the strategy to counter terror, and also one of the option is the attack over the horizon, which is from the skies, and they want to kill these extremist elements or these terrorists at their safe havens. And also they are looking for partners.
I think we've lost Ajmal for a second there. Hopefully we can get him back in us soon. I think we'll move into the question and answer session. So as I said before, there are you can put questions in the chat and I will ask them to the panelists. But I shall start with the first question, which is actually to pick up on something Ajmal was just saying, which was that the Haqqani network, so-called, it's complicated, but it's not a real thing in terms of a group as we would think of it. But those people were protecting Ayman al-Zawahiri at the end, which means that Pakistan's ISI knew what he was, since the Haqqanis were an extension of their intelligence services. And given the influence that they have over, that the ISI has over the Taliban and Al-Qaeda's entanglement with the Taliban, I basically want to ask the panel to what extent they thought the ISI would be a factor in choosing the successor for Al-Qaeda. If we go first to Ajmal.
Thank you for that fascinating question. I think the Haqqani network is probably one of the best examples of what we call in management theory a starfish network, which something which Trisha alluded to very clearly was that Al-Qaeda itself is a group of affiliates, and hitting any one of them, like with the starfish, if you hit any bit of a starfish, the rest of it's still fine, or if you chop a piece out, the rest of it works fine. That's why in management theory this model is used to describe this kind of polycentric organizations, which the Haqqani network is definitely a very powerful example of that. And one of the reasons why I think the nation building aspects so spectacularly collapsed in Afghanistan was because we used what's often called the spider model, which is the opposite side of the starfish model, where you have a perfectly functioning state apparatus with with hierarchies and offices and email addresses and logistics support bases and all the other bits that go with the state structure. But as soon as leadership goes, the entire system collapses. Whereas with the Haqqani network and with the Taliban and with many other militant organizations, removing one leader has several consequences. One of them is that immediately below that leader, if a new unifying powerful leader doesn't emerge, you get a splintering effect. And when we used to do analysis, particularly of action taken against bomb makers in Iraq, we found that the team of bomb makers, or the team under a bomb maker, would splinter into 2 or 3 teams every time a leader of that team was taken out. So I think part of the problem with this kind of leadership assassination strategy is it actually splinters the organization into further groups. making it harder to destroy them. And one US general who really understood this was General Stan McChrystal. He was in Kabul whilst I was in Kandahar, and I was very much aware of well, I was a part of the policy he was trying to implement. And he had a really brilliant and quite unique or quite new approach to counterinsurgency, which he called the math of counterinsurgency, which was 10 minus 2 equals 20. And his point was that if you kill a few people who you consider to be your enemies, then they all have relatives, brothers, cousins, second cousins, and so on, who then form part of the fight against you. And this is a key part of how we need to look to the future of how we deal with these sorts of threats. And again, diagnosing the problem correctly will help us to formulate a proper prognosis and therefore solutions.
I have done a dangerous thing and put in earbuds in the middle of an event. Can you still hear me okay? Okay, good. That was a really interesting and insightful comment in particular. Thank you for that. I would say, as just a sort of bottom line answer to your question, I don't think ISI has anything to do with who Al-Qaeda chooses as its successor to Zawahiri. And I question a little bit the premise of the idea that ISI is this puppet master that is managing things in Afghanistan to the degree that some people think that it is. I think that vastly underestimates an actor like the Haqqanis. The Haqqanis have proven themselves to be have exceptional longevity and to be able to manage conflicting interests and alliances and relationships that are in tension with one another. They're a pretty sophisticated organization in terms of how they approach these relationships. And so they have been able to manage a relationship with Al-Qaeda, which has been a clear adversary of Pakistan and has targeted it extensively. And ISI, which it has its motives for that relationship as well. So I don't see it in that way, nor do I think it's likely that the United States was acting on something that Pakistan provided to the United States. Based on my 11 years working in counterterrorism in the US government, I don't think the US government would trust that kind of intelligence and take kinetic action based on it, which could, of course, if inaccurate, prove to kill civilians, which there was a tremendous backlash in the United States for the strike after the airport attack, and then also some revelations since then of airstrikes in other conflict zones that had harmed civilians. So I would sort of separate the issues that have been raised in the question.
Thank you. If we move on to, we'll go to the next question, I think, which is, you were mentioning earlier about kind of leadership styles here and the likelihood of who comes next. Basically, where do you think Al-Qaeda is? Like, do you think that they would, you laid out what you thought for the next one, but do you think that Al-Qaeda has currently available an obvious candidate as somebody that they will be able to, will fulfill the role that Al-Qaeda needs to be able to continue on forward this moment? So if we go around the panel again, so if we go to Asal first.
I think for me, the most telling piece of open source information on the relation between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban came, I suppose, in September last year, when the Taliban achieved what for years we'll be calling a spectacular counterinsurgency, a spectacular insurgency victory in the speed at which they took the country and the relatively almost zero bloodshed against the Afghan national state elements. There'll be many PhDs written about this, I'm sure. But at that time, Al-Qaeda issued a public statement congratulating the Taliban. And that really struck me because I thought, wow, if you were a part of the victory, you would not have done that. You would have, there would have been no need to have publicly said, we congratulate our brothers, the Taliban, who've achieved this spectacular victory. So that showed me that actually they are distinctly separate from the Taliban. And I think if you look at it from the Taliban's perspective, they appeared to be as surprised as all of us were on September 11th, 2001. And the interviews that came thick and fast in the following sort of 3 weeks before military operations started in early October clearly indicated that the Taliban had no idea that this attack was being planned from Afghanistan by people they regarded as guests, and and they certainly didn't approve of the action that was taken. So whoever emerges as the next leader of Al-Qaeda, I think has a very difficult job, because first of all, they would have to demonstrate why they should be the leader. And that requires, I think, three very specific, powerful demonstrations. One is some kind of spectacular event, whether it's an attack or the seizing of a city or some other event like this, where they can, on the back of which they can promote themselves, say, look, I'm the leader of this group, we did the following, therefore I declare myself as leader of Al-Qaeda. Or secondly, there would have to be a global kind of majority consensus view, where affiliates appoint somebody and say, we the affiliates of Al-Qaeda, we decide that so-and-so person is the best to be our leader. And the third one is, I think, probably the most likely, which is whoever steps forward and says, I'm the leader, the rest will say, okay, fine, you can be the leader, knowing full well that that leadership will be largely ineffective to their organization, and that person immediately becomes the number one target for Western agencies to go and find them, arrest them, or most likely kill them. So in the grand picture, I don't think it matters too much who the leader is. The modus operandi of Al-Qaeda and other militant groups will remain largely as it has been for the last sort of 10, 15 years.
Thank you. Over to Tricia.
Yes, I think there was an article written by two of our colleagues, Craig Whiteside and Ferraro Ingram, that was really interesting, because one of the things that they did was they looked at how Al-Qaeda has not done what the Islamic State has done in terms of establishing a process for succession and establishing a criteria for its leaders. And of course, at times the Islamic State has done this and people have sort of questioned whether the person has met the criteria, but it has created something of a process, an institutionalization of the process. And of course, it's lost more leaders than Al-Qaeda, so perhaps it's had more need to do that. But I think the point of their piece, which I thought was really insightful, is Al-Qaeda has not succeeded in doing that. So thus, it's not entirely clear what somebody's credentials need to be the Al-Qaeda leader. And it creates some openings to challenge the credibility of that person. I think that it's possible that the next leader of Al-Qaeda will be just as irrelevant as Afzal has outlined, and that's probably even the more likely scenario. I do think it's also true that that person will be under immense counterterrorism targeting pressure. There was a time where we used to say that the number 3 in Al-Qaeda was the most dangerous job in the world, because Al-Qaeda was sort of losing them in quick succession for a number of years. But I think now, of course, that is probably the number 1 spot in a lot of ways, because a new leader, in order to actually rejuvenate Al-Qaeda successfully, will have to take a more visible role. And that will come with a number of dangers, especially from a counterterrorism pressure standpoint. And I do think that the Taliban is not interested in an Al-Qaeda leader who is highly visible and bringing that kind of international attention onto the Taliban. The main frontrunner people had talked about for the Al-Qaeda leadership position is Saif al-Adel, who's an Egyptian former military officer. But last information that was available is that he was in Iran and under some kind of security arrangement there. And so that, of course, is a very difficult dynamic for Al-Qaeda to have a leader who's in those circumstances. I think the UN has done a good job in its reports laying out some other potential leadership scenarios, even going so far as to suggest that some of the affiliates might take on the role. I think that's less likely. I think there are a few other candidates, including in Afghanistan, who are more likely. But I think in some ways, as I said in my comments, there is a little bit of futility about speculating on this, because there is an unknown part of knowing, well, to use a sports analogy, the bench of an organization is not always that clear to outside analysts.
Absolutely. If we go to Ajmal for his round here.
I think if the information or the informants that send us the information about the leadership, the new leadership of Al-Qaeda, if it is correct, then just a week before there was a session, or there was a gathering of some of the Al-Qaeda members participated a meeting and Sistan, Balochistan of Iran. So there were people from Afghanistan and Pakistan, and also from Iran and different part of the world. they attended the meeting. That the main purpose of the meeting was to either select or elect the new leader of Al-Qaeda. But in the meantime, so at the end of the day, they were not able to select a proper person, or for some reasons that they did not announce the result of that. But if you compare at the time when Al-Qaeda leader is dead, if you remember when 9/11 happened, and then in 2011, Al-Qaeda leader was handed by the US, for quite a long time, Al-Qaeda was not able to reoperate and to regroup because of their leader was destroyed. And you know that there's a difference between the insurgents groups and also the terrorist organizations. Their cells of or chain of command is a very how can I say that, limited to the quite little number of the people. And when you kill the leader and then you make it that these people cannot manage to get connected with the rest of their members or to their cells. So in this time when al-Zawahiri is killed, from psychological point of view, it is a huge pressure on Al-Qaeda. In the meantime, they lost like ideologue, they lost someone who was the person. However, he was not proactive in operations, but he was sort of the person who raised the ideology of jihad and things like that. But if you compare to this scenario, and then you see that in East Africa, especially in Mali and also in Somalia, the franchise of Al-Qaeda is really proactive in that area. And the information reports which I'm getting is that every day there are a lot of incidents, and a lot of the security people from Somalia and Mali, they are dying, they're losing their life. It means that the Al-Shabaab is getting the driving seat. Even the information which I received from Al-Shabaab, and they said the leader of Al-Shabaab, the Umar Ahmad, he met with the Mukhtar Rabo, who is the religious minister of Somalia, and this guy was one of the founding member of the Al-Shabaab during 2006, and he was also the deputy of this organization when the U.S. killed him, I think, in 2013, and then he surrendered to the Somali government, and then he tried to be president or run for the presidency, but he was on a house arrest, and finally in this year, in 2002, he is appointed as a minister of religious affairs. So, and then there was a meeting between Mukhtar Rabo and also the Al-Shabaab leader, and they said, and that would be a change of the modus operandi of Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda has never tried to have a specific territory under its control, like ISIS has it, like the Caliphate. Their enemy is quite clear. They're fighting against the West. They're trying to also to degrade those regimes. And in their eyes, they're run by the corrupt people, whatever. But this is the first time Al-Shabaab is trying to have their own territory. So it means the discussions. This is the secret information. They said, if the Al-Qaeda is not ready to have their next leader, Abu Omar, the head of Al-Shabaab, will take the lead and announce it as either a separate institution from Al-Qaeda to run it on his own, and meantime to be the leader of Al-Qaeda in the global affair. Even there are information that he is getting some touch with some of the Syrian operatives of Al-Qaeda, and also in Iraq and Middle East and some other areas. Even in Afghanistan, I have this information that some people, how they managed to shake hands and to cooperate. It means, I think Al-Qaeda is now in a position to a selective leader, and there would be a young and proactive and someone who has a lot of information about the operative activities of Al-Qaeda to manage the war. I mean, to make the war on the West. And for Al-Qaeda in this time, as I read the notice or some of the ideas that written by Osama bin Laden, and he said in his notes that the Al-Qaeda is not able to have the similar attack like the 9/11, but at the time, for example, for the U.S., the national security priority is to secure the sea lane communications and also the food resources and oil and gas. So I think for Al-Qaeda is the time that to attack these the food supply chain, or the food supply and the energy supply of the West, where this Al-Shabaab is really relevant, because they are doing some sort of piracy and they are more aware of the activities, how and maritime activities are done. So I think they have chosen their target, and the next target, I think, that would be American ships or the American allies ships, that the oil tankers or gas tankers or whatever. So I think in this critical time, Al-Qaeda is back to the world stage, and what the days are numbered that the same 9/11, if it is not the same, but something big will happen in the world.
Thank you. That actually leads very nicely to what's going to be the last question here, which is essentially the threat that the Al-Qaeda poses outside of Afghanistan at this point. And I leave it as broad as that. What do the panel think about Al-Qaeda's kind of global role? Is it, they've obviously taken a step back from that over the last decade, but will they re-expand, or take it where you will? If we go to Afzal first.
Thank you. I was listening to Ayman al-Zawahiri, and I've worked in Mogadishu, so I have some understanding. Perhaps I'm grotesquely out of date, but I'm very surprised to learn that Al-Shabaab are involved in piracy, because as I observe in the last at least 7 to 8 years, there's been no piracy at all, and maybe 5 years at least. Certainly it wasn't driven by Al-Shabaab. The piracy was driven almost exclusively by local fishermen who had their fishing stocks taken by Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and a whole load of other people, taking the fish stocks and leaving the fishermen with nothing to feed themselves. And they turned to the one skill they had, which was to navigate the seas, and that led to piracy. But that was largely solved many years ago, and now I'm quite sure from Puntland there is no more piracy at all. So I'm surprised to learn if that is the case today. And certainly that Al-Shabaab are trying to control territories new. That's not new at all. That's from the very beginning of their organization, from the Islamic Courts Union onwards. Al-Shabaab have been trying to rule central Somalia with their version of Islamic law. So I think we have to be very careful, especially those of us who have Muslim backgrounds and Islamic studies backgrounds, because many of our colleagues who don't have those backgrounds look to us for, and I think incorrectly, they look to us because we have a shared faith and a shared cultural background with some of the people we're trying to discuss for an authority. And if we conflate disparate issues into one big sort of counter-terrorism, counter-extremism narrative, we'll end up doing exactly what we've done for 20 years, which is not solving problems. And I think it's if we want to address militancy, terrorism, extreme ideology, then we have to look at what drives that and deal with it from a root causes perspective, and not constantly fighting symptoms. In any other issue that humanity faces, which we try and take seriously, we try and identify the root causes and deal with those, in addition to alleviating symptoms where possible, but generally we try and solve things at their root. And if Al-Qaeda is going to present an international threat to anybody, then it's going to do so from ungoverned spaces or where there's state sponsorship. And both of those aspects can be dealt with with our own effective relationships around the world, and a values and law-based response to that sort of threat. And I return again to the importance of how we behave as Western governments, as Western security apparatuses. How we behave has a direct impact on whether the threat grows or whether the threat wanes. And that's a critical part of how we move forward. Whatever they do, they shouldn't impact on what we do. We should always respond in accordance with what's going to work in the long term and on a much more permanent basis. And that's really my appeal to all of us.
Thank you. We go to Tricia next.
It's hard to follow that kind of appeal, but I'll give it a try. I think that the U.S. intelligence community has recently weighed in on the question of at least the scope of the threat to the United States, and has indicated that at least for the short to perhaps medium term, there is a limited threat from Al-Qaeda to the West. I think one of the things that we constantly have to calibrate when we're talking about threat is sometimes we, when we talk about, especially with Al-Qaeda, when we talk about Al-Qaeda capability, we're talking about a 9/11, scope of an attack. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's just not the kind of capability that Al-Qaeda is going to have again, or that any organization will have again, in part because of the measures that were taken to secure the homeland, and the additional measures that were put into place after that attack. So then I think we have to think about the capability and the threat along a spectrum, right? Everything from small scale, perhaps like the attack on Pensacola that was inspired and had some links to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We know of instances where, Al-Shabaab, one of the affiliates, sent one individual to get pilot training in the Philippines, but that was detected and he was arrested. So I think we need to think about capability more along those lines than to think of it in the sort of large scale, really sensational, simultaneous kinds of attacks that we once knew Al-Qaeda for. I think for the short term, medium term, that's the kind of threat that we're looking at from Al-Qaeda. It's a much more opportunistic, much more small scale kind of threat. I think the long term gets very difficult to assess because there's just a lot of variables that we don't know. But I do think that there is a change, not just to Al-Qaeda's capability, but to the ability of countries that would be targeted to protect themselves as well.
Thank you very much for that. Ajmal, use the final round.
So I find two basic changes, or two more important changes in the policy of Al-Qaeda. The first thing is that Al-Qaeda was like imperialistic organizations. They were not looking for a specific territory to control, like ISIS. The one thing I'm talking about is if Al-Shabaab takes over Somalia, that would be a specific territory under the flag of Al-Qaeda. And the second thing is that which I observed, and I'm getting the classified information about the financing. So if you compare the finance of Al-Qaeda with the financing of ISIS, this is quite different. So the paper shows, or the information shows, that either Osama bin Laden himself financed the group, or there were some donations from the very rich people around the globe, specifically from the Arab world. But the ISIS has done a lot. For example, drug dealing and also drug cartels, they were involved. They were even selling slaves, and they were also the illegal sale of oil, gas, and things like that. And robbery, like bank robberies and hostage taking, and then they get money out of that. So this was the method that how they financed the organization. But the recent information, which is just I received from last week, in Afghanistan, there is a canal, a Kosh-Tepa canal, in the north of Afghanistan, where the Taliban at the moment, they do not have money, the budget to launch such a project, a big project, which is which needs around 10 to 15 million dollars that to be operable. In such a time that the Taliban government is under significant pressure, I mean economic pressure, and then they're coming forward and they said we will finish this project. This project is mean that they will around like 100,000 of hectare land would be watered out of that. So it means that the Taliban in the past, they tried to cultivate poppies in the northeast and the northwest part of the country, but in the south that was not felt a lot. But nowadays they are trying to by finishing this project, they are trying to put a lot of pressure on the northern parts of Afghanistan that they will cultivate more poppies, and the way is that the money which they will receive out of these poppies, and then of course they would be transferred to the Central Asian countries, to Iran, and even they will reach out to Europe and also the United States. But at the very beginning, one thing that could do is the organized criminality will be one of the point that could happen in Central Asian countries, and this called cross-border terrorism. So it means that if the Taliban regime exists, or the Taliban regime is ready to operate a bit longer, it means that Al-Qaeda will have significant finances out of the poppy field from Afghanistan. It means with that money they could arrange some attacks, and they could finance themselves, and they could do whatever their target in the future will be. So, and coming back to the other point, so for me, as in comparison to other terrorist organizations, the Al-Qaeda is more secretive organizations. In terms of their command, in terms of their operations, in terms of their mobilization, whatever. So it would be a little bit difficult to find them and to kill them, because as one of the CIA operatives said that he compared the KGB operatives with the terrorists. He said the KGB is easy to find but difficult to kill, but he said the terrorists are difficult to find and easy to kill. So finding these terrorists, as it takes, for example, for al-Zawahiri, it took 20 years so to find him and to kill him. So I think as they are operating very secretively, it means that would be very difficult to find them and kill them and bring them to justice. And therefore, I say that Al-Qaeda would have a significant role in the future of the world, and especially in terms of the terrorism and counterterrorism.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody else for contributing. It was great to have you all here, and we hope to see you again soon. Good afternoon.